Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Sheila Carter has no way been a woman who processes treason still, but the moment she learned about Deacon Sharp and Taylor Hayes crossing the line from fragile fellowship into a full-blooded love, commodity inside her snapped with a nipping futurity that transferred shockwaves through every corner of Los Angeles, because this wasn't just another slight or romantic disappointment to be filed down and weaponized laterally. This was a soul-deep demotion that clawed at her pride, her preoccupation, and her precisely curated sense of fortune, and as the verity settled in, Cleric, the man she believed she had eventually reclaimed, and Taylor, the woman who represented everything Sheila believed she was unfairly denied, her covetousness metastasized into a dark, each-consuming fury that felt less like wrathfulness and more like an oath written in gravestone. A pledge rumored through gripped teeth that two people would pay for daring to find happiness without her, and from that moment on, Sheila's studies grew sharper, colder, more deliberate, as she replayed every smile Cleric had given Taylor, every trusting look Taylor had offered him, seeing them not as innocent gestures but as deliberate acts of business meant to abolish her, to replace her, to prove that no matter how hard she tried to resuscitate herself, she'd always be the stranger looking in. And this consummation burned a rage so violent it blurred the line between heartache and revenge. Because Sheila doesn't just feel covetousness, she embodies it, nurtures it, allows it to bloom into commodity dangerous and calculating, and those closest to the situation could smell the shift incontinently, the way her voice dropped when their names were mentioned, the way her eyes dallied just to alternate too long on prints of Deacon and Taylor together, the way her smile came tight and unsettling, as if she were formally rehearsing the fate of a storm only she knew was coming, and in her mind the narrative was clear and enduring. Cleric had used her, suspended the vision of redemption and connection only to discard her for a woman with a polished character and a forgiving history, while Taylor, with her calm wisdom and moral authority, had committed the ultimate sin of taking commodity Sheila believed was rightfully hers, and so the love that everyone differently saw as mending and hopeful came, through Sheila's eyes, a protestation of war, a provocation that demanded a response equal to the pain it caused, and as her wrathfulness coddled, it darkened into commodity more regular, less explosive but far more intimidating, because Sheila has always been most dangerous when she's quiet, when she stops contending and starts planning, when her feelings solidify into intent, and this time the intent was murderous in its counter-accusations. Not in graphic fantasies but in a nipping certainty that two lives stood in the crosshairs of her vengeance, as she began to speak in portentous half-rulings and loaded conceits, telling anyone who would hear that treason has consequences and that love stolen always demands payment, her words transferring jitters through those who honored the familiar meter of a Sheila Carter treble, the kind that starts as rhetoric and ends as tragedy, and indeed as Deacon and Taylor tried to concentrate on their own fragile happiness, ignorant of how deeply they had touched off her. The air around them thickened with foreboding, because Sheila's covetousness was no longer reactive, it was purposeful, driven by a crooked sense of justice that framed her implicit conduct as ineluctable rather than monstrous, and in her mind she wasn't the villain, she was the woman wronged one too numerous times, pushed past the point of remission, forced to reclaim control in the only way she knew how, and that internal defense only made her more bent, more vulnerable to reason, more willing to contemplate consequences that would devastate not just Deacon and Taylor but everyone connected to them, as the plot took on a darker, more suspenseful edge, transubstantiating a romantic disclosure into a ticking time lemon, because when Sheila vows vengeance, it's no way just about the immediate targets, it's about transferring a communication, about rewriting the narrative so that she's no way overlooked or undervalued again, and as rumors of her raising preoccupation began to circulate, concern spread among those who had witnessed her once rampages, people who understood that Sheila's rage doesn't burn out snappily, it evolves, adapts, finds new energy in every perceived slight, and the fact that this treason involved two people she fixated on made it exponentially more unpredictable, because now her covetousness had a binary focus, a crooked harmony that allowed her to imagine discipline as balance, as lyrical retaliation for the happiness she believed had been stolen from her, and the darkness of her oath lay not in unequivocal pitfalls but in the unwavering calm with which she spoke about fortune, about fate correcting itself, about love stories that end poorly when erected on falsehoods, and as observers watched her descend further into this mindset, it came insolvable to ignore the peril brewing over Cleric and Taylor's love, A peril embedded not by unforeseen violence but in a slow, deliberate unraveling driven by preoccupation, wounded pride, and a continuance of undetermined grievances, making Sheila's covetousness feel less like a passing emotion and more like a force of nature, one that promised desolation not because it wanted chaos for chaos's sake, but because it believed destruction was the only way to restore order. And as the B&B macrocosm braced itself for the fallout, one verity came chillingly clear: Sheila Carter's rage had crossed a threshold, and with two people now forcefully in her sights, the line between trouble and action had no way felt thinner, leaving everyone to wonder not if her covetousness would claim victims, but when and how the deadliest chapter of her vendetta would eventually be written. As Sheila's fury continued to coil tighter beneath her precisely controlled surface, the days following the disclosure of Deacon and Taylor's love took on an creepy, suspension-laden quality, because while the rest of the world moved forward, laughing, loving, and pretending peril was lurking just beneath the face, Sheila broke down, getting more observant, more patient, studying every commerce like a chess player mapping out an wind-up, and it was in that silence that her rage truly progressed into commodity murderous, because she no longer demanded to roar or charge or supplicate to be seen. She had formerly decided that the macrocosm had wronged her formerly again, and that correction would come not through remission but through consequence, and every participated regard between Deacon and Taylor, every tender moment eavesdropped or inferred, fed her conviction that this love was only in personality but a provocation daring her to respond, and Sheila has no way been a woman to ignore a dare, especially when it touches the raw wimwams of abandonment that has defined her entire life, so she began constructing a narrative where Cleric was simply a man who moved on but a snake who exploited her vulnerability, a man who offered stopgap only to rip it down the moment commodity better came on, while Taylor, in Sheila's mind, converted from compassionate healer into sanctimonious pincher, someone who sermonized understanding and redemption while still taking what Sheila believed she had earned through suffering. And this distorted perspective gave her wrathfulness structure, a sense of righteousness that made her feel justified rather than deranged, dangerous rather than hopeless, and as that mindset hardened, the trouble she represented grew exponentially, because Sheila with a cause is far more shocking than Sheila acting on impulse, and those who knew her history began to feel the subtle warning signs, the calculated grins, the pointed questions, the way she dallied in places she had no real reason to be, always near enough to watch, to hear, to absorb, as if she were feeding on the happiness she planned to destroy. And Deacon, though blissfully caught up in the comfort and pledge of his relationship with Taylor, could relatively shake a creeping apprehension, a sensation that followed him like a shadow whenever Sheila's name surfaced, because some part of him understood that he'd undervalued the depth of her attachment and the inflexibility of her response, yet indeed that mindfulness was dulled by his belief that Sheila, for formerly, might choose restraint, that she might accept rejection without retribution, a stopgap that proved dangerously naive as Sheila's internal harangue shifted from mourning what she lost to imagining how fluently everything Cleric and Taylor cherished could be taken from them, and in this phase of her preoccupation, she was interested in quick or messy vengeance. She wanted commodity further ruinous, commodity that would loiter, commodity that would force them to feel the same helplessness and treason she felt every time she trusted someone who eventually chose someone differently. And so her studies began circling around exposure, insulation, cerebral unraveling, the slow dismantling of reports and connections, because to Sheila, ruining lives didn't always bear blood, it needed timing, influence, and the amenability to cross lines others wouldn't dare approach, and that amenability was commodity she had in cornucopia, forged through times of survival and rejection. And as she rehearsed scripts in her mind, visioning moments where Deacon's confidence atrophied and Taylor's countenance cracked, she felt a crooked sense of calm, as if planning vengeance restored a balance she'd been missing, as if fastening on their downfall gave her purpose when love had failed her yet again. And this was the most unsettling part of Sheila's descent, because she wasn't twisting, she was stabilizing around a darker core, getting more centered the closer she got to embracing the part she knew so well. And while others saw Deacon and Taylor's love as a symbol of mending and alternate chances, Sheila saw it as evidence that the world awarded the wrong people, that virtuousness was picky and redemption was reserved for those with the right last name or the right image, and that belief only corroborated her determination to expose what she considered insincerity, to remind everyone that puck tails erected on treason always end in ruin, and as whispers of her resentment spread, concern mounted among those who flashed back what happened the last time Sheila felt cornered, because history had tutored them that she does. "Ent lash out blindly, she studies sins, delays for emotional fault lines, and strikes when her targets are most vulnerable," and with Cleric and Taylor intimately navigating a new relationship, their vulnerabilities were far and wide, ripe for exploitation. From Deacon's fragile sobriety and need for acceptance to Taylor's character as a moral compass whose fall from grace would shock and destabilize the community, and Sheila knew this, delighting the harmony of it, the lyrical justice of watching two people who believed they were doing the right thing unravel under the weight of consequences they no way anticipated, and indeed as she assured others that she had accepted the situation, that she was moving on, that she only wanted peace, her eyes told a different story, one of stewing resentment and cold resoluteness, because Sheila Carter has always understood the power of deception, the value of appearing inoffensive until the moment she chooses to remind everyone exactly who she is, and that memorial felt imminent, hanging in the air like an approaching storm that darkened every scene it touched, making indeed the quietest moments between Deacon and Taylor feel portentous in hindsight, because nearly, just out of sight, Sheila was watching, calculating, staying for the perfect occasion to make good on an oath that no longer felt like a trouble but like a pledge, and as the pressure escalated, the question shifted from whether Sheila would act to how far she was willing to go, because her covetousness had formerly crossed into preoccupation, her wrathfulness had hardened into intent, and with two people forcefully cemented in her mind as the engineers of her pain, the path she was on sounded less like a choice and more like fortune, one shaped by times of loss, rejection, and a grim need to be seen, indeed if being seen meant getting the darkness everyone stressed, and as the B&B world edged closer to the breaking point, one thing was inarguable: Sheila's rage was no longer just a response to Deacon and Taylor's love, it was the catalyst for a reckoning that hovered to consume everyone in its path, proving formally again that when Sheila Carter loves and loses, she doesn't walk down still, she makes sure the fallout is indelible. As the tension tightened and the emotional temperature around Deacon and Taylor's romance continued to rise, Sheila's inner world grew increasingly detached from ordinary morality, because in her mind she had already crossed a threshold where conventional rules no longer applied, where right and wrong were measured not by law or compassion but by loyalty and loss, and every step Deacon and Taylor took toward building a future together felt like another deliberate shove pushing her further into the shadows she knew so well, and it was there, in that shadowed mental space, that Sheila began to fully embrace the idea that destruction could be intimate, that revenge didn't have to announce itself with sirens or chaos but could unfold quietly, patiently, like a poison seeping into the foundations of two lives that believed themselves safe, and this belief shaped her every move as she inserted herself into conversations just long enough to plant doubt, just long enough to remind Deacon of his past mistakes and Taylor of the fragile glass pedestal she stood on. Because Sheila understands people, understands fear and guilt and shame with an expertise born of experience, and she knew exactly which emotional threads to tug to make even the strongest bond begin to fray, and while outwardly she played the role of the wounded but accepting woman, inwardly she nurtured a growing sense of inevitability, a conviction that Deacon and Taylor's happiness was temporary by nature, that it was built on borrowed time and borrowed trust, and that all she had to do was wait for the right moment to collect what she was owed, and that waiting, far from torturing her, empowered her, because patience gave her clarity and clarity sharpened her resolve, and she began to view herself not as a jealous ex but as an instrument of truth, someone destined to expose the cracks beneath a love story everyone else was too blinded by hope to question, and this self-justification allowed her darker thoughts to flourish without resistance, because when someone believes they are right, they no longer hesitate. And Sheila stopped hesitating altogether, her mind circling around the idea of two people not as abstract targets but as symbols of everything she had been denied, two lives that represented acceptance, redemption, and second chances she felt were dangled in front of her only to be snatched away, and this symbolism made her fixation more dangerous, because it wasn't just about Deacon and Taylor as individuals anymore, it was about erasing the narrative that people like them deserved happiness more than someone like her. And as she fed this belief, her sense of isolation deepened, cutting her off from any lingering voice of reason, because isolation has always been Sheila's breeding ground, the place where her worst impulses are nurtured rather than challenged, and as she withdrew emotionally from everyone except herself, the world narrowed until it contained only three figures, her, Deacon, and Taylor, locked in a twisted triangle defined by betrayal and obsession, and in that narrowed world, consequences felt distant and abstract, easily dismissed in favor of the immediate satisfaction of imagining their perfect image shattered, their moral certainty shaken, their future thrown into question, and this mental rehearsal became a ritual, something she returned to whenever anger threatened to overwhelm her, because imagining their downfall calmed her, steadied her, gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt since learning about their romance, and that calm was what frightened those who noticed it, because calm Sheila has always preceded chaos, a pattern etched into the memories of everyone who had survived her previous storms, and as unease spread quietly through the community, small moments took on outsized meaning, a look held too long, a comment that landed slightly off, a coincidence that felt too convenient, and Deacon, though still deeply invested in his relationship with Taylor, began to feel the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him, a nagging sense that his past choices were catching up to him in ways he couldn't yet see, because some part of him understood that Sheila's silence was not acceptance but preparation, and that understanding bred guilt, guilt for underestimating her pain, guilt for believing he could simply move on without consequences, and that guilt made him vulnerable, exactly as Sheila intended, because vulnerability is the crack through which doubt enters, and doubt is the beginning of destruction, and Taylor, too, found herself unsettled by an inexplicable sense of foreboding, moments where her professional composure faltered under the weight of intuition she couldn't rationalize, because as much as she believed in healing and forgiveness, she couldn't entirely ignore the history that trailed Sheila like a warning label, and that internal conflict, between compassion and caution, created its own tension, a tension Sheila was more than willing to exploit, because Sheila thrives in gray areas, in moral ambiguity, in the spaces where good people question themselves, and as she observed Deacon and Taylor navigating these subtle shifts, she felt a surge of grim satisfaction, proof that her presence still mattered, that she could still disrupt, still influence, still command attention even when cast aside, and that satisfaction fed her resolve to push further, to test how fragile their bond really was, because in Sheila's worldview, anything that can be broken deserves to be broken. And if Deacon and Taylor's love was truly as strong as they believed, then it would survive her interference, but if it wasn't, then its collapse would simply confirm what she already knew, and this twisted logic absolved her of responsibility in her own mind, allowing her to frame whatever happened next as inevitable rather than intentional, fate rather than choice, and that framing was the final piece she needed to fully commit to her vow, because once someone believes their actions are guided by destiny, they stopped questioning themselves altogether, and as the days passed and the tension continued to mount, the atmosphere around Deacon and Taylor grew heavier, charged with an unspoken sense of danger that neither of them could quite articulate but both felt deeply, as if their happiness had drawn attention it wasn't meant to attract, and in the background of every moment, unseen but ever present, Sheila waited, her patience unwavering, her focus razor sharp, knowing that storms don't need to rush, they only need to arrive at the right time, and as the BNB world edged closer to that moment of impact, the idea of two people in serious danger took on a chilling resonance, not because violence had erupted, but because something far more insidious was unfolding, a slow-burning reckoning driven by jealousy, obsession, and a woman who had decided that if she couldn't be part of the love story, she would make sure it ended in darkness. Proving once again that when Sheila Carter feels erased, she doesn't fade quietly into the background, she reclaims the narrative in the most unforgettable way possible. As he lingered unseen, wrestling with the realization that power gained through control is brittle, while power earned through trust is resilient, and somewhere between the applause and the music, Will understood that this was the consequence he could no longer outrun, while Dylan, sensing the magnitude of the moment, found himself pulled aside by industry leaders eager to collaborate, to hear his vision, to offer opportunities that extended far beyond LA, and for the first time, the question of leaving the city no longer felt like escape but expansion, a possibility rooted in choice rather than exile, and as the night wore on, alliances subtly realigned, whispers of Forrester's internal fractures grew louder, and the empire Will had fought so fiercely to preserve began to feel increasingly fragile, because institutions, like relationships, depend on adaptability, and rigidity only accelerates collapse, and when Electra finally took the stage to address the crowd, her words cut through the noise with quiet authority, speaking not of revenge or rivalry but of courage, of knowing when to walk away and when to build anew, of refusing to shrink to fit someone else's fears, and as her gaze swept the room, it briefly met Will's, a fleeting moment charged with everything they'd never resolved, yet instead of anger, what passed